In today's show, it's player preview season, our final player capsule leading up to the season. And today, check your watch. It's Damian Lillard time. Welcome to Locked On Blazers. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Trailblazers, your daily Portland Trailblazers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What up, world? It's your past first point guard and Trailblazers reporter, Mike Richmond. You're listening to another episode of Locked On Blazers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, available wherever you get podcasts and also on YouTube. Thanks for making this show your first listen every day, free on all platforms, 5 days a week, the only daily Trailblazers podcast. Why not make it part of your daily routine, make it your first listen every day? Is Locked On Blazers, your team every day. Today's show was the final installment of our Locked On Blazers countdown to tip-off. We're running through every player on the roster, and we finally gotten to the ends. We give you a brief but thorough look at what they'll bring to the Blazers this season. We start by looking at how they performed last season. We talk best and worst case scenarios, and then we finish up the show talking expectations and role on this upcoming team, on this year's squad. If you missed the others, check your podcast feed, or if you're a YouTube watcher, there is a playlist, season previews, all of them right there waiting for you. Catch up today. It's a good place, jumping off place if you are getting excited about the season or getting new to, trying to get caught up on what's going on with the team as the season approaches. You were listening to Thursday, October 13th show. As this premieres, we are a week away, 6 days away from the beginning of the season, the opening night. So you got time to catch up. These are all like 25 minutes long. You can listen to a bunch of them in a row, but it's a great place to, if you're a new listener, to get caught up, or if you are trying to share the podcast with someone, or if you just want to get ready to think about the season, it's a great place to do it. Make sure you check those out. Today, we're setting our watches, making sure that they are timed right for a franchise pillar. It's time to talk about Damian Lillard. Damian Lillard last season averaged 24.0 points, 7.3 assists, and 4.1 rebounds in 36.4 minutes a night across 29 games. He shot 40.2% from the floor, 32.4% from three, and 87.8% from the free throw line. He appeared in 29 of the Blazers' first 35 games before his season ended. But he wasn't himself. Basically, from night one, he was not himself. In training camp, Damian Lillard told reporters that he felt as good as he'd ever had, as healthy as he'd been in years. The abdominal injury that was clearly a problem when he was playing for the Olympic team in July. He'd had, a month or so off. He'd gotten married. He'd gone on his honeymoon. He'd just gotten off the basketball court. And that amount of rest and that time away from the court, his body was feeling good. Told reporters as much in the preseason. But he clearly was not himself. In fact, this is a guy who averaged, 28 and 8 previous seasons. He didn't crack the 30-point mark until a month into the season, game 17 on the calendar. He averaged 28, 30 points as an extra bucket one random night. For Dame, it took nearly a month to hit that figure. He missed a chunk of 5 games to try to get right, missed another one late in December, in the middle of December, and then his season finally came to an end. On December 31st, following a 33-point loss to the Los Angeles Lakers, Damian Lillard decided his season was done. At the time, the Blazers were 13-22, which meant two things. One, it spoke to how much Dame had struggled. He just wasn't himself. A lot of guys would be excited to average 24, 4, and 7, but Lillard, one of the game's best shooters, shooting below 33% from three, shooting just 40% from the floor, and just not looking like the explosive, left-hand drive monster that we are accustomed to seeing. He wasn't himself. He was not right, which explains why the Blazers were 9 games below 500. But the record also suggests why Dame was willing to accept the direction that this surgery was going to mean. 2 weeks later, on January 13th, he had surgery to address the abdominal injury that he had been dealing with for at least 4 years, the way he tells it, 4+ seasons, 4.5 years, a tightening of his core, as he would call it, later described as a sports hernia the size of a baseball just above his groin. Yeah, like a wild physical discomfort on a guy who had a 30-point per game season one year with the Blazers. A truly special talent, robbed of what makes him special by an injury that finally caught up with him in his 31st year on this fine planet. There were some whispers that when Dame went out that, oh, he could maybe come back. But the implications of him deciding to get surgery when he did in December, and with the Blazers record what it was that this team was going to head in the other direction. Instead of pursuing the playoffs, they were going to pursue holding on to their lottery pick and drafting high in the following draft. 6 weeks after, there was an update that, oh, maybe Dame could, he's progressed through the first part of the rehab, and he's going to get back and do some work on the court. Again, whispers that he might return. But he never did. He didn't return in late March and April and the final weeks of the season, a season that the Blazers were, aggressively losing at that point. There was really no reason for him to return. It was mostly just maybe optimism or, I don't know, the need to draw up interest in a team that had lost 21 of its final 23 games. Hey, maybe Dame will come back. Tune in. But Damian Lillard didn't go anywhere. In fact, on July 29th, nearing the end of free agency, Dame signed a 2-year, $122 million max contract extension, a deal that includes a $66 million player option for the 2026-2027 season. Assuming Dame picks that up, and he will, it would keep Dame in Portland for the first 15 seasons to begin his career, should he play out the remainder of that contract as a member of the Trailblazers. That's a decade and a half rocking the pinwheel. A decade and a half as if not the best player in franchise history, certainly on Mount Rushmore. At worst, Damian Lillard is the third best player in franchise history. At best, he's the greatest Blazer of all time. And by the time he were to play out this contract, he'll be at the top of every meaningful record in the Blazers record book. Minutes, points, games played. He's likely going to pass Clyde Drexler as the franchise's all-time leading scorer before the calendar flips this season. Sometime there's a chance this year, but certainly next season if he's around and under contract for 5 more years, will be the franchise's all-time leader in assists as well. He will be the most prolific Trailblazer ever if he plays out this contract. It won't be close. He will have his name in every longevity record, every major record. It will say Damian Lillard at the top. You might still be debating what best Blazer of all time means, but you won't be debating over who is the Blazer, the franchise guy, the icon, someone who they will straight up, if they're still doing that in 2027 or whenever he retires, 2035, building a statue for him. But this show isn't about what Dame did in the past or what Dame will do in the future. These player previews are about what Dame will do next season. In the second segment, I want to talk about best and worst case scenarios for Damian Lamont Ollie Lillard Sr. in the 2022-2023 season. That's what we'll do in the second segment. But first, let me tell you about BetOnline, the fastest and easiest way to bet on all of your sports action. More lines, more props, more odds than ever before. And more lines, more props, more odds than anywhere else. It's football season. It's about to be basketball season, so get ready. We're less than a week away. But right now, we're in the heart of the NFL season, the heart of college football season. That means all weekend long, Saturdays and Sundays. If you want to get in on gridiron action, you can do that. The NHL season just got underway. The NBA season is less than a week away from being here, so you can get action on that too. If you want to bet on soccer, it's happening all over the globe, even as the North American soccer leagues wrap up their season. You also got golf, you got tennis, you got combat sports. Whatever it is, you're going to find it on BetOnline, so don't wait. Go take advantage today. It's BetOnline, where the game starts. All right. Let's keep it rolling. Talking best and worst case scenarios for Damian Lamont Ollie Lillard. As a caveat, as we do at this time, this is best case scenario within reason. And worst case scenario without injury. We're talking about what's a reasonable best case scenario. Dame's pretty high, higher than certainly others that we've done in the same space. And worst case scenario without getting hurt. We're talking about what happens on the basketball court. Damian Lillard, as it is for star players, has an extremely, let me say that again, extremely narrow window of what best and worst case scenario looks like. So what's the best case scenario for Damian Lillard? So he averages 29 and 8, shoots 40% from 3, and he's one of the best 5 offensive players in the league. The best case scenario is that he's a borderline MVP candidate, a shoe-in all-star, and guides the Blazers to an easy top 5 offense while sprinkling in a little more off-ball terror than we've seen him in the past. The best case scenario is that Damian Lillard is the force you remember from the last time he was fully healthy. The best case scenario is that Damian Lillard at age 32 isn't that much different from Damian Lillard at age 30. The best case scenario is this guy who has been that good, still that same guy. The best case scenario is Dame, and we don't really talk much about him. We just say, wow. Couple wows in there, a couple okays in there, and a couple magic late game moments. The best case scenario from Damian Lillard is that he's the Damian Lillard that you have come to expect a statue for. Like I said, the worst case scenario is so dang narrow. What does the worst case look like? It's the Dame averages 26 and 6, shoots 34% from 3, and is simply one of the 15 best offensive players in the league. The worst case scenario is that Lillard doesn't necessarily jive with the more off-ball role that Chauncey Billups' offense has presented him this season, and that the offense sputters from top 5 to something like 14th. The worst case scenario is that Damian Lillard is not the Dame you remember, but simply a very good basketball player. The worst case scenario is that Damian Lillard is not in the MVP discussion, but more like a borderline all-star for a team that is not as good as they once were. The worst case scenario for Damian Lillard is that he just succumbs a little bit to aging and a year off, and it takes him a while to get going. And by the time he finds his rhythm, the Blazers are scrambling to get back into the hunt. The worst case scenario for Damian Lillard is a type of season most players work all their life for. But that is the sort of the subtlety, the magic, the specialness of what makes great players great. Is that the best case scenario is 29 and 8, and the worst case scenario is 26 and 6. It's narrow. The difference will be in the margins. The difference will be subtle, but the difference will be dramatic. So instead of spending a big chunk of time and a big amount of energy figuring out where the walls are for Dame, figuring out where the poles are for Dame, so the best case scenario is intended to find, the high end outcome and the low end outcome, with the idea that players will fall in between. Dame's going to land in between. He's not going to have a 30 and 10 season. It's just very unlikely. The only year he did that, they needed, they played fewer games, and he had a heroic run in the bubble. A unique setting, to be sure, but he's not going to fall off a cliff. This dude isn't going to average 17 points per game. He's too damn good for that. So we know it's narrow. I want to talk about role and expectations. I want to skip ahead to the final segment of this show because for me, Dame's expectations in many ways mirror the Blazers' chances. It is the burden of being a franchise pillar, is that your success will in many ways determine the success of the team, the success of the franchise, and perhaps even the direction of the franchise moving forward. So let's fast forward. Let's skip ahead. Let's go to that third segment and talk about realistic expectations for Dame and his Portland Trail Blazers. Join me in the third segment, won't you? Still a past first point guard. I'm still Mike Richmond. You're still listening to Locked on Blazers. We are still talking Damian Lillard. As I mentioned, the expectations for Damian Lillard are perhaps best understood as the expectations for the franchise. If Dame slips towards something that looks like the worst case scenario, if he is merely a slightly above average three-point shooter who's averaging 26 and 6, the Blazers might struggle. Why Dame has been so special over the last half decade, right? Like when he stepped into this in the post-LaMarcus era at this echelon that he's, the Blazer fans just haven't seen a player of this caliber since Drexler, right? Where he's just like, oh, this is one of the 10 best players in the league. We've got a chance because this dude wears the jersey. Dame has been a positive player, a net positive player, because he has been a tremendous and elite offensive force. During that same stretch, he's been a bad defensive player, pretty consistently a bad defensive player. I think he made improvements, like he was worse prior to the 2018-19 season on defense than he was after. Like he was super duper bad, and then he progressed a little bit. But I would say even his last fully healthy season, he was a bad defensive player. No bones about it. Not a defensive talent. And at age 32 and in year 10 and all of those things, the idea that he's going to progress and be something like an average defensive player is silly, and it's not what you're asking of Damian Lillard. It is not the ask. Very importantly, it is not neither the expectation nor the request is that he takes this massive step forward on defense. It would be silly to think that he could. It would be silly to ask him to do so. What makes Dame so special is that he was one of the 5 best offensive players in the world, an offense all unto himself, an absolute force. That if he had the ball, if you rolled the ball out and said, Dame, go get it, he could go get it, and you would be a top 10, if not straight up a top 5 offense because Damian Lillard was there. That is what made Dame so special. He was a net positive player because he was one of the best offensive players in the league every single year. So if he is not quite that, as I said, if the pendulum swings a little towards the worst case scenario, then the Blazers might struggle. Last year, the Blazers roster felt stale. This season, it feels fragile. And I think the sort of expectations in the pendulum for Dame speak to that fragility. Their margin for error is just super, super thin. They don't have a ton of NBA bodies, like quality NBA bodies on this team. They've got probably 7+ you could count on. I think Nasir Little struggles in the preseason make you feel like it's not 8. But if you're assuming that Gary Payton and Justice Winslow get healthy, you got 7+ Nasir Little that you can count on. That's not quite enough to field a quality NBA team. So in some ways, there's even more pressure on Dame to be the elite of the elite. There is even more pressure on him to show up and look like the Damian Lillard of old and say, it's cool. If I'm out here, we're going to be one of the top 5 offenses in the league. If I'm out here, defenses have to pay so much attention to me that everyone else can eat. If I'm out here, it's easy picking on the weak side. If you can spot up and get open, I will find you, because they have to commit a second defender and they have to commit a third defender as a helpline defender to get there. Run a pick and roll. I've got, minimum 8 eyeballs on me. We'll be fine. But if Dame isn't a top 5 offensive player, if he's, a top 10 offensive player, a top 15 offensive player in the league, still one of the best offensive players in the NBA, right? Still absolutely one of the best offensive players in the NBA. But if he's more like Devin Booker, where it's yeah, that dude's awesome. He's really good. He's really hard to guard and all of those things. Then the Blazers might struggle because they do not appear to have the personnel to be a good defensive team. Damian Lillard is a bad defensive player. Anthony Simons is a bad defensive player. Josh Hart is miscast as a small forward. Their path to being really good is leaning into their strengths. And their strengths are what the franchise pillar does well. He's a bucket. And if Damian Lillard remains at a bucket at the highest of highest levels, they're going to have a puncher's chance to be really good. You think that they've upgraded their, in theory, they've upgraded, and maybe you don't think, I don't want to put those words in your mouth, thoughts in your head. In theory, they've upgraded their defensive personnel, but even if they have, I don't think they have the depth and the right type of defenders to avoid putting some negative defenders on the court basically at all times. Dame and Ant are going to play a bunch of minutes together. If you do that, you're going to struggle on defense. It's just the reality of it. The way the Blazers are good this year is that they make some trades to rebalance the roster, but more realistically, like, they're just an elite offensive team. And that's the expectations for Dame. That is the burden that he carries, is that this team has its flaws, and its flaws mirror his flaws in those ways. Like, they're not a very good defensive team, in part because their number one guy's not a very good defensive player, and you build with what you have, you work with what you have. But he is an elite offensive player at his peak, and their path to being really good is having that elite offense yet again. It feels a little bit fragile, like I said. It feels more fragile than it has in the past. It's kind of the nature of a guy entering year 10. You saw it in year 6 and 7 and 8 and 9. Or 6, 7, and 8 before he got hurt. It's like, this dude is so good. This is the prime of one of the best players in the league. Dame is entering the backside of his prime. For the best players in the league, the prime is extended into their middle 30s, to be certain. I don't think Dame's going to fall off a cliff, like I said. I think the worst case scenario is 26 and 6. But that fragility, the difference in being one of the 5 best offensive players in the league to one of the 15 best players in the offensive players in the league, is maybe the difference in the Blazers being like a team that is competitive for the playoffs versus a team that is like very, very clearly a play-in team or below. It is unfair to place the burden of success at the feet of Damian Lillard and say, oh, well, they'll go as far as he takes them. It is also the burden that franchise players carry, and someone like Dame, who has very much tied himself and his identity and his branding to this team and to this city and to the Portland Trailblazers. It is the burden that he has accepted and quite frankly has to carry. That's how this works. So I don't have a prediction for necessarily where the pendulum swings. For Dame, it's going to land squarely in the middle of a very, very narrow hallway, a very, very narrow channel. But the Blazers' margin for error is that thin. The difference in them being good, competitive, fun, and enjoyable, and another tough loss, a 39-win team, is probably similarly razor thin. In a brutal Western Conference, the difference in winning 44 games and being right there in 6-7 versus winning 41 games and being right there in 8, 9, 10 is 3 nights. It's 3 nights. It's a couple bad bounces. It's all of those things. The difference in the Blazers being really good and being kind of not so good is Damian Lillard being the 5th best offensive player in the league and the 11th best offensive player in the league. Hard for me to call where the pendulum lands, but I know that the subtle differences that I can't detect or predict will define how this season goes. An unfair burden, but also the realistic burden of what it means to be a franchise pillar in a market like this, on a team like this that has built a roster such as they have. I want to say this too. I've been pretty negative on this show recently because I have watched the Blazers play and they haven't been very good, and I like to keep it real. When I see them play poorly, I call it like it is. But the reason to be a Blazers fan, the reason to be a fan of any sports team, is to allow yourself to be hopeful and to enjoy the special things. Damian Lillard is the special thing about the Portland Trailblazers. The fun part of the season is watching an all-time great ply his trade for the team you love. So if you are able, and many of you are, and don't need this pep talk, but I've seen the comments, I've read the tweets. If you are able, allow yourself to appreciate how darn good Damian Lillard is, and appreciate the moments when he is the best player on the floor, because sports, life is fleeting. Hold on to your joy. And if Damian Lillard, who if you're a Blazer fan, has brought you more joy than anyone else over the last decade, hold on to the moments when you can enjoy how special he is. Allow yourself to be hopeful that he is still that guy. Because quite frankly, he might be. He probably is. And if he isn't, he's still going to be one of the special ones because he's that good and he has been that good. And after surgery and a bunch of 6 months to get his body and his mind right, he has a chance to go into the season and kind of steer this thing. And watching him steer this thing is the fun part about rooting for this team. So allow yourself a moment as we head into the season to be excited about what that means. To watch Dame in the winter when it's dark and rainy in Portland and say, hey, this dude makes November through February a whole lot more fun. Hold on to your joy. Hold it close. Never know when things change. That's going to do it for today's show. Like I said, this is the final. This is all 14 players I've previewed in the player previews. If you haven't listened to the others, go back and listen to them. Listen to the Shaden Sharp one. Listen to the Anthony Simons, to the Nazir Littles, the Jeremy Grant. Everybody's got an episode in there. If you're a YouTube listener, there's a big playlist. If you are a podcast listener, they're in your feed. They're labeled Portland Trailblazers season previews. You'll be able to find them. Also, do me a favor, come back for Friday's show. It's one of my favorite shows of the year. We're doing over-unders. A listener, Ben, sends them in, and I bring my friend Chuck on, and we go through over-unders predicting the season ahead. It's seriously one of the most fun episodes of the year. Do not miss it. That'll be Friday's show. We'll have more shows next week and the beginning of the NBA regular season. I love it. I love this time of year. I love the NBA. I'm so excited meaningful basketball games are back, and I'm so excited to be sharing my enjoyment of it with you, dear listener. So tell your friends. Tell them to come in and come and share the enjoyment, share the excitement, share the fun of Locked On Blazers, of Locked On NBA, of the NBA at large. Tell your friends about this podcast. Available wherever they get podcasts, also on YouTube. I appreciate you listening. I'll talk to you soon.